I noticed that as well. It's not what you got it.
You know anybody in that picture?
I'm good. How's your young life?
You mean my kids? My kids are doing well. They just fucking in the house on Friday.
Oh, wow. In DeKalb or Sycamore? Oh.
Anymore at 6 though. I'm like,
In Ward 6, well, you know, tell them to watch the governance.
further west, and you'd be okay.
I know.
They got a fantastic so,
Really?
yeah, they're all average house. It's a house. I went down tonight and moved into this house.
Oh my gosh.
The backyard is the land.
It's like a little private forest in a way.
They're in the hall. You can
Friends of mine.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Committee of the Whole meeting, July 24, 2017. Roll call, please.
Jacobson,
here.
Fanouken,
Here.
Marquardt,
Here.
Fagan,
Here.
Noriko,
Here.
Verbeck,
Here.
Favor,
Here?
Smith,
Here.
8 present.
There are no items from the regular agenda that are on the Committee of the Whole meeting this evening, so we'll move into two considerations that we'll be considering tonight. The first is code compliance, building, and economic development, and I'd like our Community Development Director, Joellen Charlton, to come to the podium to speak on this item. Joellen?
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, everyone. This report was prepared in response to some requests that we received to provide an overview and the status of some internal changes that have been happening in community development. The changes were intended to increase efficiency and maximize the use of the limited resources that we have for both code compliance, building review, and property maintenance. And before we start with that, it's helpful to understand the history of the Building Division and Community Development Department as it existed in the past. So prior to the recession, the city had in-house building division with many employees for code enforcement, new construction, and building permits. When the recession came, there was some pretty massive layoffs that resulted in about 3 people remaining in the building division. They were left to do all of the work for building plan reviews, inspections, and whatever code enforcement was left. So it doesn't take very long to figure that a lot of code enforcement was the last thing on the list, and not a lot of code enforcement was happening. At that point, too, what we saw was kind of a disbursement of the various positions to different departments and functions that used to be in community development being farmed out to other divisions as well. So, for example, fire-related plan review was being done by personnel in the fire department who would review plans for compliance with fire-related codes. Over time, after not being able to commit resources to code compliance, our buildings were deteriorating. And so in response, the city did review the possibility of doing more code enforcement for residential properties for both owner and rental occupied. Ultimately, that whole discussion resulted in a program that culminated in the Crime-Free Housing Bureau. And again, because of limited resources, we started the genesis of the Crime-Free program, but at that point, we really had no department to put them in. So the Crime-Free program itself was police-based. It was put in the police department with a full-time coordinating position and part-time inspectors that were identified for that work. Fast forward to 2014, the city had outsourced plan review and inspections. Again, this was done initially as by the city manager's authority in response to some issues that had been occurring. So for about 18 months, we had one consulting firm that was performing that work for us while we were identifying what we wanted to do moving forward and creating an RFP for ultimately contracting out those services more full term. With that RFP, we identified our current building plan review consultant, which is HR Green. And with that company came a whole new level of expertise that I don't think the city had seen before. Through them and other organizational changes, we discovered that we had many inefficiencies in our current model, or in that model at the time. For example, in one mixed-use project, because everything was so decentralized, so at this point, keep in mind, we have people doing code compliance in the police department, we have some inspectional work being done in the fire department, and we have building plan review work being done in building. So we could essentially have one building, one multi-use building, where we would have crime-free doing work on one floor, our building inspection division doing work on another, and a fire prevention officer also being out there. Because of the decentralization, there was very little coordination of that work. Also, what we learned with H.R. Green's expertise was that there was some benefit of having that level of review available for new economic development projects that were coming before us. It became very easy to include their knowledge up front as we were starting to consider new projects coming into the community and identify some of the issues that sometimes would take all the way through the approval process before they were identified. Our initial agreement with H.R. Green contemplated having that full-time inspector here pretty much on a daily basis, but as needed. So the assumption being that if at some point we didn't have as much development and we needed to pull back on those services, we could. And if we needed more services, we had the ability to tap into additional inspectors if required. That contract also included a CBO type person, or a chief building official type person, and that's the Don Plass that we've come to know and appreciate through his services here. Originally, at the time the RFP was developed, we thought we needed some guidance into developing the model at the time, and that was prior to us even looking at some of the things that we're doing now. If you will recall, at that point, we were also undergoing an update to the city's building code, and through his time here at that point, he was intended to work with our Building Code Board of Appeals on the amendment of those codes, which were adopted earlier this year. So in looking at where we had been and what was working after having H.R. Green here and in place, we decided to look at all of the operational models that had occurred. We looked at our past model and decided what did and didn't work about that, where we'd been in the middle, and what was happening with the presence of H.R. Green. And again, we are continually asked to optimize the use of our available resources. So that review resulted in a recommendation that all building functions, including inspections, permitting, and code enforcement, be centered into a single department under common leadership. So again, we could address those issues of inefficiency of different departments assigning people potentially to the same building. The benefits of the model include, again, to address those inefficiencies, the ability to assign staff based on priorities or expertise. In some cases, we had highly trained people going out to do an inspection and identifying a problem with a code-related issue, and then, sometimes that inspection results in the need for a follow-up inspection. Not something you need to send your most highly trained individual out to do. It could be someone who's either doing another inspection close by or who is maybe not as highly qualified for a technical building plan review. We also learned that having one qualified individual with the knowledge of all building and property maintenance codes was pretty beneficial. So in our prior model, we had fire department professionals who were very in tune with and knowledgeable about fire codes, and the crime-free housing was knowledgeable on property maintenance codes, and the building code people who were responsible for the building codes, and maybe we weren't all looking at the same things. So having, again, a benefit of this model was to have one person overseeing all of those functions and making sure that we're being consistent in the application of our codes. This is not to say that the Crime-Free Housing Bureau hasn't continued to be, or has been and will continue to be, an amazingly successful program since it began. But one of the complaints that we heard from people, and mostly the newer people that come in on a routine basis, so students and their parents, was that they would see a vehicle pull up with the words crime-free on the vehicle, and that was disconcerting to some people. They felt like there was a crime being committed in the neighborhood, and that's a complaint that we heard. I think people who knew about the program didn't have that concern, but it is something that we heard. So again, bringing the divisions into one department would allow us to address that issue and maybe do some retitling of the position. Once we decided that community development might be the right place to house the new program, we determined that it could functionally be more efficient and could also capitalize on opportunities to change discussions from code enforcement to community enhancement and economic development. Much like we had been experiencing with the presence of the chief building official through Don Plass at HR Green, it was apparent that having that single person with the oversight was critical to the program. Structurally, it made sense to identify that CBO person that would oversee all of the internal staff related to building plan review, code inspection, and code enforcement, and then also supervise the contractual services, again, like HR Green. So we have more projects, more people, or less projects and less people. So we could adjust how we assign those services. If we had projects, we could put those resources there, or we could pull them out, however it was necessary. At that point, we did have some internal conversations with the elected officials and some various members of various groups in the community, just to say that we were thinking about this. What were your thoughts? I think generally the response was positive. We didn't really have a large pushback on any of the suggestions that were being made, mostly because of the efficiencies that we were talking about. So how do we fill this position? At this time, we had a position that had become vacant in our long-range planner. Derek Highland had left the city late last year, so we had an available position that we could take a look at. And in looking at the resources that we had at the time, we had Jason and Dan were doing a really good job on the plan review, inspection, and economic development, but we really saw that we had this need in this preliminary step in bringing this person in to help up front with some of these preliminary issues to promote economic development, and then also incorporating that crime-free plan review and code enforcement functions that would help us do a better job at maintaining the buildings within the community. So as currently designed, the CBO is identified to oversee crime-free staff, which includes the supervisor and part-time staff. Those positions have all been transferred to community development with no changes in pay. The only difference that is now they are titled code compliance inspectors and a code compliance coordinator. Crime Free will continue to do what it has done all along. It's been a successful program, and it's continuing to be a successful program this year, as provided in the staff report. They do continue to coordinate closely with our police department, and will continue to do that, but they are also doing some additional property enforcement or code enforcement work as well. The fire prevention lieutenant will still technically report to the fire chief, but is now housed in community development, and again is working with that CBO position. Right now it's being filled by Don Plass, and again that's to create that consistency in codes and interpretation. The position has been advertised, and we are looking through candidates at this point. No hire has been yet made, and we're bringing this item to the council as an update while that process is ongoing. So I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has at this point about where we're at with this program.
Prior to discussion by the city council, I'd like to ask Will Heinisch to come up. Will has registered to speak to this issue. Will? While Will is passing those out, let me remind those viewers tonight and those in the audience that our Committee of the Whole meetings are basically designed to provide information. We will be taking no action on any of the two considerations that we'll be discussing tonight. With that, here's Will Heinisch.
Thanks, Sherry. Good evening, Council. I am Will Heinisch, a local landlord, property owner, businessman, and farmer. I have also served on the board of directors for the DARA organization and am a founding member of the organization. I was actively involved in the Quality, Safe, and Housing Task Force for 2 years and assisted in writing the disorderly house ordinance, which jump-started the crime-free housing department. I have a filing cabinet full of documents and recorded videos of all meetings. In fact, Dara paid for the first meetings to be videotaped, and then from there out purchased copies of all meetings from the city. So we have quite an extensive database and record base. Some of these documents I've attached for you this evening in the packet that I just handed out to council and to city staff. And actually, if you review, there's only one alderman that still remains in office since all this was passed. And to start out with, on the first page, Dara, we do agree with Joe Allen in the city that code enforcement should be in the community development department, and supports this move. Dara stated this multiple times from 2010 to 2013. Dara also supported back in the day when they moved the crime-free housing department from City Hall, which was an annex, to the police department. We supported that move as well. However, crime-free housing, which should include the crime incident reporting, registration, and landlord classes, we feel still should stay in the police department. In fact, I remember the first day after it was approved, we went over and I saw Carl with the start of the program. I went down across to City Annex. They put him down in the basement in the corner. And I went around and he, open arms. Carl says, "Welcome. Here's my office." And he had a used desk, a used chair, a used computer, a used whiteboard. They gave him a used retired police car, used pens, used pencils. But he did have a couple brand new stacks, reams of paper. And that's what he started the crime-free housing department with. And he goes, "I'm going to try and get them to let me have some paint so I can freshen this place up a little bit down here." So with Carl, we started a great relationship. And at the same time, we were starting the Dara organization as well, which has been successful at the same time. And over the years, I believe in holding and pushing landlords to higher standards. Some members, which are no longer members of our organization because they could not follow our code of ethics. We've had a good relationship with the chief and Carl. But on the front page here, I've got some questions. And these may generate and stimulate some additional questions or thoughts from council as we kind of go through some of these. An additional backup material I have presented in the back of this packet. But the first question is, how much in funding is raised from registration from landlords? If you look, the estimated amount from former manager Bernanke was supposed to be about $227,000 in 2013. That's illustrated on page 1 in your packet. And you can see for distribution that you should also remember that there should be an equal administration of the law and or ordinance between owner-occupied and rental property. So when this was initiated, it was 100% rental property only. The second question being, how much do the part-time code inspectors currently make? In 2013, 100% of their time was spent on rental properties for code enforcement and was paid for by the city's share. You can look at page 2 and page 1, but page 2 was the actual solicitation for those part-time inspectors, what their duties were, and it was approved at $18.55 an hour for a part-time inspector. It also shows that the total budget at that time for this department was $284,000. The third question was, how many landlord classes have been offered and what is the number in attendance? To the benefit which we supported, again, the city changed the ordinance that landlords do not have to repeat the class every 3 years. Through Carl's excellent teaching skills, he felt that the landlords didn't need to repeat every 3 years, and that simple email notifications and updates could be effectively sent that way. And I also believe the registration process and the class forced some of the out-of-town landlords to have a local person represent them at the same time, which was very beneficial. There's also in the ordinance where a landlord may have to be required to repeat that class if he's not applying proper procedure and has too many crimes. So one of the questions I have is how many landlords has the city required to retake the class per the ordinance? And one of the final questions, in 2013, 100% of the crime-free housing coordinator and assistance time was spent on rental property. What is the percent of time now spent specifically on crime incident reporting, registration, and landlord classes? Since its inception, code for residential properties has been added. We've had reduction in classes, reduction in incidents at rental property, and more responsibilities have been added for non-rental related. If you look at the numbers based off the crime-free housing incident report in 2013, there was roughly 352, which was a partial list. 2014, it was 437. You can say each year it's been decreasing. So 2015, 315, 2016, it was 262, and as of 2017, as of June 29th, there's only been 71 incidents reported. So I would like to commend Carl, the police chief, and I think Dara deserves a pat on the back overall for this trend. In fact, I hate to say it, but I think Carl's success has basically worked him right out of a job. So in summary, though, I have one request, which is at the bottom, that we have a roundtable meeting with the mayor and an alderman and city staff to discuss answers to the above questions and a fair reduction in fees, as the program has been a success and allowed the city to reallocate resources and restructure. Services rendered must equal fees charged, as landlords are being overcharged, and equal administration of the law and/or ordinances must apply. DARA requests crime-free housing, or the portion of the crime incident reporting, registration, and landlord classes we still feel should stay in the police department, for the exact same reason that they're moving the code department to community development. We actually also believe that the crime incidents may start to increase by moving this program out of the police department and to community development. We also have ideas for additional cost saving or revenue generators for a neutral budget if needed. I have attached on the back of this package from 6A to 6O an additional survey or study that was done by City Manager Mark Bernanke that he ordered, and that may actually provide some additional insight for tomorrow night's meeting, which I will be addressing you again tomorrow night. Not all statements I agree with, other than issues that were facing the city then are still a challenge to us today. Always feel free to call on me at any time to answer any questions or any insight, day, night, or during a meeting. We look forward to having the roundtable meeting soon before registration is set out for next year. Again, thank you, council. Appreciate your patience.
Thank you, Will. I commend you on having such a complete presentation, giving it to us in writing, and we really do appreciate that. Prior to Joe Ellen perhaps making another comment, we would like to open this up to any discussion. And some of your points, I'm sure, has prompted some, Will.
Mayor, can I jump in?
Yes, Anne Marie.
Just in the interest of time, I mean, a couple of things I want to point out. Chief Lowry, I believe, made a presentation to DARA on this consolidation. I'll defer to the chief. It was either early April or early May. We regularly meet with representatives from DARA at our business coordination meeting once a month. We have at least Will Heinisch and others that are usually there. This is now late July. It's a little disconcerting to hear this in a public meeting instead of the avenues that we've built where we try to have this type of conversation and be able to address it. So without spending a lot of time at tonight's meeting, because the purpose of this was to address Alderman Jacobson's issue, I would suggest allow us as staff to sit down with DARA to try to address these issues, and then for us to follow up at a subsequent meeting. That would be my recommendation to you.
Thank you. Any comments from the council? Alderman Jacobson.
As Will mentioned, I am the last surviving member up here, as I've mentioned many times myself. And to know what the process was to create the Crime-Free Housing Task Force and what an arduous process that was. It didn't take a 60-minute cow. It didn't take a meeting with one group. It included stakeholder meetings. It included hundreds and hundreds of volunteer hours through the housing task force. It took probably over 100 hours of council meeting time, at least, individually, 100 hours apiece to get up to speed and to have the discussions and to have the issues, to discuss the startup costs for Crime Free, which were in the hundreds of thousands of dollars when you account for the legal fees and the tool-up costs and the vehicles and those things. Again, I have some significant issues with the fact that we decided, was the discussion in Joe Ellen's conversation, we didn't decide anything. When it was the council decision, again, after hundreds of hours of input and discussion and vetting and getting community groups involved and having the stakeholders involved and having volunteers involved, just to get to that point because we were sold that that would be the answer, to do it without any public review or public discussion or council input at that point, I think was a poor choice by the city and the city staff, unfortunately. I realize that the ship has probably sailed at this point, and it was why I requested at least an update of what still exists, what parts of Crime Free are still there. Does Crime Free even still make sense at this point when we look at their call numbers, when we look at the fact that they were shouldering the burden of inspection and now there'll be another supervisor doing that? Again, there's an intricate web of things we built. It wasn't by accident. We built them through the fire department, through commercial inspection, for that reason. We built Crime Free through the police department for that reason. They weren't accidental coincidences in how the whole program and how the patchwork of inspections came together. So again, do I think that it does probably fall under community development? Yes. Do I think that there are efficiencies there? Probably. But without having that discussion, without vetting those things, without knowing those things, such a major reorganization of staff within the city and effectively changing what all of that input and time and effort that was a public process to something completely different without it, I feel we did inappropriately. And that's why I asked for at least the update tonight. As far as specific questions, crime-free housing does still exist at this point. Registration does still exist, correct?
Yes, and I think when it gets in the topic of crime-free, I would ask that either Director Charlton address this. I also think it would be beneficial for Chief Lowry to address this because crime-free housing has not changed. The only thing, as far as their mission, the only thing that is different is the location of the structure of what department. But I think the chief can attest that the effectiveness of crime-free housing has not been diminished. Chief, perhaps you want to address that?
Yeah, as I listen to the conversation, I hear both sides, and I think it's good to hear the voice of both sides in regard to this. A couple of things. As I reflect back on the one thing that stands out for me that I think is worth noting is that if we try to break down value of crime-free by numbers decreasing in caseload for actual crimes in rental properties and say that they are no longer of value, I think that is a strategic, terrible mistake. From my perspective, that's their goal. And through that, they sustain their other operations from inspections to other things, but the greatest tool that they bring to the table is the ability to collaborate with property owners. And I think that's why it was key when I sat through those meetings with Dara and, from the beginning of this, and I look at, the struggles both sides had with, bringing this program together. And the biggest thing they bring to the table is the partnership with the property owners and property managers. That has paid its way in dividends time and time again. I also see as these properties change hands, especially when we start to see a property owner not doing the right thing. And I think we all see it. That re-education, not just the re-education in the classroom, but doing the steps that Crime Free does, like individual mentoring of certain property managers to get them up to speed. The personal touch that Carl brought to the table, both from inception to date. I think the value of that is huge. Big picture wise, if you fail to look at that from a value point of view beyond number of cases, it's so easy to count beans. When we stop doing this, if that's where this conversation would ultimately lead, whether it's today or 3 years from today or 10 years from today, the mistake will be all that ground gained will be lost because of the changing demographic that goes on in this community year after year after year in these rental properties. And of late, the change in ownership of these rental properties. So I know I've gone into a lot here, but I really think the thing to focus on is the value of the program and watching it attain its goals and how we keep that going. The other component I would address as well, and there are varying perspectives. You know, I'm a tried and true policeman. I like the police image, and if people come into town and they're offended by that, I'm sorry. You know, it's like saying, please forgive me for my patriotism. I'm not that way, but I understand it from a bigger picture perspective within the city as far as a welcoming mat. But in looking at Crime Free and the value of the program, along with the conceptual beginning of Crime Free, I think it's very important for us to understand that the mission was enhanced when we got all three entities under one roof. And I'll say it here to you, and I'll say it to this community. There was no good communication or coordination between Code, Crime Free, and any other entity in regard to, for example, the fire department and fire life safety. That was key. Because what happened was you saw properties for year after year after year that could pass a fire life safety, but in reality, if Code was on top of its game, would never have passed Code. And as an example of that, I can only look to where I spent only 2 years of my career in Crystal Lake. A professional organization, probably to this community would seem oppressive in regard to code enforcement. Yet it remains one of the top 10 cities in the nation of its size. They had very effective enforcement, very effective code compliance, and people failed, you know, properties failed, but new property owners came in and brought those back to life within the code. In DeKalb, we're situated in a change, and this is, maybe I should shut up, Your Honor, but here's where it's at for me. I look at a past of terrible habits. If I could walk into a building, a liquor licensed establishment in this city, and see a ceiling fan with electrical power daisy chained to the roof and plugged into an outlet, being serviced by a generator in the alley behind the business because they can't afford to pay their electric bills, what does that say about where we are as a municipality? That owner should fail, and ultimately did. What does it say when you can walk into a licensed liquor establishment, go in the basement, and see their beer lines running through 3 inches of sewage in the basement? That tells me that no matter how much lip service we give to this program, good or bad, we were failing. And it wasn't because we wanted to be oppressive. We wanted these communities, these businesses to thrive. We want the rental properties to thrive. But if we don't have this mechanism, we're going to pay a price for it down the road. The communication coordination end, I think, is well served where it's at. I think the mission of Crime Free is success. What I see going on here today is, I think the alderman, and I'm not debating opinion, because certainly everyone's entitled to it. Will, who I respect, I consider a friend. I respect his opinion as well. But I think we're going to enter into a debate about dollars and cents. Should rental property owners be paying for a service that started out at this level and is now at this level in comparison to other services that they are also assigned to do at this point in time because they put in charge of those items, such as property maintenance? That's where this debate appears to be heading. So from my perspective, I hope I've answered your question. I apologize for rambling on. I'll stop there.
Anne Marie, did he answer your question?
He did.
Good. Okay. Any other comments? Alderman Arrico.
You know, I wonder if the reduction in incidents that Crime Free is reporting, it's one of those situations, they're doing their job. Therefore, the property owners, property managers know that standards have to be met and adhered to. And it's one of those situations that if they weren't there doing their job, do people go back to old habits? It's too easy to fall back into those old patterns. And, just like a parent always has to be on guard, so to speak, in some ways, because there's a range of, people willing to pay attention to these standards. I think that, the active presence of Crime Free helps ensure that the city standards are met.
Further discussion? Joellen, would you like to comment on any of the questions raised or any of the comments that either Anne Marie or Chief Lowry made?
I would just say that I agree with Anne Marie's comments about taking a closer look at some of the questions that were asked and coming back to the council if that's what is desired. I also agree with the chief. I'm not sure that looking at getting this into a cost game is the best way to go. We have taken all of the existing available resources and rearranged them in a way to become more efficient. Yes, maybe the Crime Free Housing Bureau is doing more than they did in the past in areas not related to Crime Free, but the truth of the matter is they continue to do the Crime Free program, and they continue to do it very well because of the basis that they've put together, and because the landlords and everybody that's used to the program and following the protocols of the program are doing a better job. And so, again, I think as we try to look at ways to take very limited resources and do the most with those resources, this reorganization to me makes a lot of sense.
David?
I'm a bit frustrated by that, by those total comments. Again, I think we've established the benefit of Crime Free, and the list of responsibilities was significant at one point, and now those responsibilities have been significantly reduced. So I don't think that it's foolish to at least look at those costs. When you talk about efficiencies, when you talk about, again, the changing of responsibilities, to not look at those costs would be a dereliction of our duty and a dereliction of the city's duty. If we've decided that there's a better way to do things, and again, that goes back to the genesis of all this, when some of this was being discussed, where there were significant concerns that Crime Free was dealing with code enforcement. There were significant concerns that there wouldn't be enough work without that aspect to have a full-time coordinator for that program. There were significant concerns from the landlord community saying that we're going to put in more than a homeowner is, and we don't think it's fair that they should get the same services that we're paying for. And the city blanketly addressed those things by saying, don't worry, that it'll all be taken care of, and this is the greatest thing in the world, and we vetted this program, and then we've admitted of our own accord that it wasn't efficient, it didn't work well. And again, I don't think that's what's at issue here. The two issues we have are, through the public vetting, through the council input, does this system now that has been created, does this answer and address all those things? Are there other efficiencies? Are there other things both the council and the community want to see from these programs? Is there a better way to do it? And without that discussion, again, it's yet another plan that's being presented as the bee's knees this time through, and in a year or two it may change again. So, I mean, that's part of the frustration, is that it's not necessarily just about dollars. It's not necessarily about where code enforcement lies. Again, I think everybody agrees that our old system wasn't working correctly. I don't think anyone disagrees with that from any of the sector of the community. But then that should have been addressed, and we should have been having that discussion. And we should have, especially as council members, been engaged in making it better, not just being handed a stack of paper saying, well, a change has been made, and now it is what it is. That's my frustration here, is that the process was wrong. The process in a major staffing change did not include the council. That's the issue. It's not the issue of how much it costs at this point. There may be some issues from the landlord community that are probably valid issues, that they stated at the beginning back in 12 and 13, that their fear was, hey, the city's going to come in and charge us all this money, and either those fees are going to skyrocket at some point, or we're going to be paying for services that everybody benefits from, or that the private homeowner is benefiting from, that we're not seeing value from. And the city said, no, that could never happen. And now, 2 or 3 years from the onset of the program, that's exactly what's happening. So again, it's through that public discussion, it's through that council input, that I think we could have had the discussion of how we better these things. We could have had the discussion to understand, how do we maximize our existing resources, especially with Crime Free, after putting in the $100,000s of dollars of tool up for that program, to make it make the most sense going forward. Again, that's not merely counting the beans, that's taking a look back and self-inflecting on the organization and saying, let's all go at this 100% instead of throwing something at the wall and hoping it sticks.
Alderman Verbeek.
I appreciate Alderman Jacobson's comments about the semantics of us receiving this information and when. And I happened to attend a presentation. Chief Lowry did a great job of explaining how things were being reorganized, which I appreciated, but do agree, Alderman Jacobson, that we could have perhaps been presented that first. But semantics aside, for me, this is a priority. And why is it a priority? Because I continue to hear from residents and business patrons and property owners and such that this truly is a priority. So I think as we approach budget time and we work through priority-based budgeting as to what are these important matters, whether it's this or signage enforcement or you name the litany of priorities that we have in the city, I think that's going to be a very rewarding process to figure this piece out as well as all of the other pieces. I would agree with some of the comments you shared. I don't like crime-free. I'd like to kind of end it now and call it Help DeKalb or whatever we would like to call it. But crime-free does send this image that it is saying, well, we know there's crime out there, so let's go out there and find it. I don't like that, so I applaud however those comments came through, that would be a better approach.
So Mayor, if I could suggest a couple things. So number one, I hear Dara wanting to meet and have questions. So as staff, we will gladly sit down with Dara. We'll address their issues. We've built great lines of communication through business coordination meetings that we have on a regular basis, and if it's that avenue or another avenue, we will definitely go down that route. I've heard Alderman Verbic come up with an excellent suggestion that as part of the budget process, we'll quantify. I mean, that's part of our budget discussion as to how much the crime-free housing program is worth and the value to the community. The third component I would just address is operationally, we make decisions on a daily basis, weekly, monthly, annual, where we're continually looking at what is the most efficient and effective way to provide services, whether it is having a certain division within a particular department or having a certain person in a particular department. Part of what was, I think, highlighted in this memo was the timing. Some of these changes were taking place even before newly elected officials were sworn in, so this is a process. We have heard loud and clear to include the community. We've had input. That's why the chief went to the DARA meeting to reach out, to explain this was the transition, but we're always open for further suggestions as to how to do that. We brought this up at our business coordination meeting. All the conversations we've had were supportive. We did not really hear anything negative. You were correct, Alderman Jacobson, we did not have a public discussion. We have reached out through other discussions with council members to discuss this prior to newly electeds being sworn in. The feedback we got from all the elected officials at that time, and I don't recall even negative comments, and if I'm incorrect, even coming from you, we got positive feedback from the council as far as some of these changes that were taking place. And if I'm incorrect in that statement, I will be the first one to say that. So we will work on this. We will sit down with DARA. We will highlight this during the budget process and seek further feedback from you at that time.
Alderman Verbic.
And certainly more of who I would like to hear from are residents, our patrons of businesses. What are they seeing? What are they, do they have an item that they're just not comfortable sharing elsewhere? So Help DeKalb could be a portal where people anonymously can report some of these issues that I think so many are hesitant to report.
Thank you. Any other comments? Joe Allen? Or David, do you have another one?
I'm going to throw it back to the chief to give his plug for Alert DeKalb because I know he's thinking about it.
Help me with that one again, Alderman.
I said I'm going to throw it back to you after Mike was saying we should have a good process for anonymous reporting of code complaints. I'm sure there's something that the city has done recently to address that you can share with the residents.
Yeah, we, in concert with actually folks from DARA and led by Will Heinisch, when we still had iWatch in operation, we created a Code Watch component. Now under the new system with Alert DeKalb, that component remains in place, so there's certainly a mechanism in place from that aspect where people do report everything from long grass to somebody selling narcotics out of a home. So, I mean, it captures a wide variety of information.
Thank you.
Joe Allen, did you want to make one final comment?
I'm good.
Okay, well, it's obvious we're not going to resolve all of the issues tonight. At the very least, what we will do is to meet your request for a roundtable meeting with the mayor and aldermen, city staff, to, as you say, to discuss answers to the above questions. What I'd like to see us do, if it's okay, and I suspect Mark Thorson, we can put some of the questions that Dara has raised here today, or that Will has raised, on our website. Do we have a place where we put those so that those folks tonight who don't have a copy of this can see the questions that Dara has posed? Anne Marie.
Yeah, Mayor, could I suggest, this is going to be reflected in the minutes, so for anybody, they're going to be able to watch this meeting and they can see the specific questions, and when the minutes come before the council, you're going to have that document, because I know the clerk has been taking very detailed notes.
Thank you. Any further comments on this item? As those of you who have listened to this new mayor over the past 8 weeks, one of my frustrations has been our scheduling of committee of the whole meetings at 5 o'clock when we're supposed to start a city council meeting at 6. So I would ask for our second item tonight, the rating update by William Blair, Managing Director, Elizabeth Hennessy. And I'll toss this question to our interim finance director, Jeff Wilkins. Jeff, can we take care of this item in 10 or 15 minutes? And if the answer is no, we will move this to another date.
We can take care of it and within 10 minutes and hopefully address all the questions too.
Please do. Our interim finance director, Jeff Wilkins.
If I could, just for time, I'll introduce Elizabeth Hennessy from my desk here to go up to the podium. The presentation, I'm going to hand out a hard copy to all the aldermen. It's also in your packet electronically. So, Elizabeth, if you could go ahead and start, I'm going to go ahead and pass
Welcome,
it on.
Elizabeth.
Thank
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you all. Good evening. So tonight, I wanted to just give you an update on Moody's Investor Service. They have rated your bonds since the 90s, and their job is to not only rate bonds when you have a new issue, but to do what's called a surveillance rating. So every year they call the city and we have discussions with Jeff and Anne Marie and review the bond rating and make sure we get all their questions answered. So the city has had a AA3 with a negative outlook, and it dropped that AA3 rating this time to A1. And this is a drop between categories. It takes you from the AA to the single A category. And it's due almost entirely to the higher pension liability and based on Moody's restatement of that pension liability and dependence on revenues from the state of Illinois, which I think is a general condition that all municipalities are dealing with as our state struggles with its budget. So the following conditions will make the rating go up, and that is expansion and diversification of the tax base and moderation of the city's unfunded pension liability. That's really the whole issue. The good news is the EAV has increased. Your tax base has grown this past year. That was duly noted. Another very strong positive is the financial operations of the city, and the report even directly stated that solid reserves and improving financial position was very much a positive. But the thing that they keep going back to is the pension. So before I get into that, I want to go to pages 2 and 3 just to kind of give you a history of the city's rating with Moody's Investor Services. So the Moody's first rated the city back in the year 2000, October 20th of 2000. You see some ratings back in 92, 94, 96, and 97, but those were ratings of a bond insurance company that insured the issuance of the bonds. So in 2000, the city received a AA3 rating and kind of kept that rating all through the early 2000s. And then in 2010, it had a AA2 rating with a negative outlook. Now it's confusing. AA2 is a step up, but in 2010, Moody's did a recalibration. It was in the wake of the financial crisis, and the SEC was telling the rating agency that they were rating municipalities on a much tougher basis than they were corporations, and so they recalibrated their rating, so your AA3 automatically turned into a AA2, but they put a negative outlook on it. And the reason they did that is because if you go back to 2010, you might remember the city's fund balances kind of hit an all-time low back then. And since then, the district or the city did some reworked, did some layoffs, did some rebuilding, and also set forth certain financial policies which you've really adhered to and brought that operating fund balance back up to the 25%. So the negative outlook was to reflect kind of the financial difficulty in 2010. So then going to 2013 and 2015, you kind of held on to the AA2 The negative outlook was removed in 2013 with the issuance of some of your bonds back then for the police station and for the library. And then it came back, the negative outlook popped back in 2015, again stating the pension. And now here we are in 2017, and we've gotten this, they took the negative outlook away, but we're downgraded to A1. So that's a little history, and if we go to page 3, you can see what these ratings mean. We've got Moody's ratings on the left-hand side and Standard & Poor's at the right. The very highest rating is AAA, then AA1, AA2, AA3, and then A1, which is where you are now. So the single A category has strong capacity, but susceptible to adversity. And you can see where our state and the city of Chicago are on this chart too. You're certainly well above the line in terms of investment grade, unlike some of the other largest city in the state. But you know, dropping those rating categories from AA to single A is just a fact of life in terms of the pension. So let me just kind of give you a recap on the pension on page 4 and talk a little bit about why Moody's is focused so heavily on this particular statistic. So in 2016, your pension liability, adjusted liabilities went up by 11%. Part of that was due to you moving from the project unit cost methodology to the more conservative age entry normal method. So that actuarial method in itself made your pension liability higher. It's a more conservative view. Now, that is a good thing from Moody's point of view, but it still made that number go up quite a bit. The second thing is that Moody's applies their own ratios to your pension. Your actuary uses a assumed investment rate return on calculating that liability of 7.46%, but Moody's uses Citibank's pension liability index of 4.34%. So if you look on page 4 on the right, your in your audit, it values your adjusted liability at $178 million. But after Moody's applies their methodology, it turns into $261 million. You take that number, you subtract the actuarial value of the assets in the plan, giving you a net adjusted net pension liability of $164 million. They look at your operating revenues and how many times your operating revenues have to be multiplied to cover that liability, and they come up with that ratio of 4.91. For other cities, they like to see that, for AA rated cities, they like to see that between 1 and 2. So you can see how you're moving away on that. They're very concerned about that. So just page 5 is kind of a commentary, just summarizing these items regarding the pension. And before I go to the next page, I'll just entertain any questions here about this rating.
Comments from the city council or questions? David?
The comment you just made that the general ANPL is a 1 or 2 for AA rated. I mean, we're looking at, as long as we're keeping up at that 4.95 range, it's very likely we're going to be continued to be downgraded, correct?
It's going to be a focus, right? That they want to see you at least tread water, keep it the same, get it a little lower. And remember, the pension in debt is really supposed to be only like 10 to 15% of the whole rating. So what Moody's is telling you guys is that that portion that they evaluate you on is kind of overshadowing all the other really good things, like your tax base getting stronger and your fund balances being stronger. So.
And just to clarify, when we're talking $164 million liability, that's an unfunded liability. That's what
Correct.
We owe those pension funds at this point.
Based on the actuarial calculations, right.
And at what point, I know that was a priority of the city when Kathy was here to at some point this year lower our actuarials, because obviously 7 2.5% annual return is not near what most of the pension benchmarks are now. What is the time frame at looking to do that?
We will be presenting actuarial report, taking that to the Finance Advisory Committee. I think it's probably September, so we will work with them to see if any modification and recommendations on pension allocation should be made. So that's about the most specific I can get, is we're going to take it to FAC first.
And I think the most important understanding for council to have, now going through this for as long as I have, is while a lot of the previous council went out patting their backs that we had so much money with a 25% fund balance saved, it's not a drop in the bucket toward what we owe in terms of our liabilities at this point at $164 million. And that's why we're getting crushed on our bond ratings. So the reality that we're going to need to take bonds at some point to start to address some of the issues we have in our community, whether it's infrastructure or otherwise, is pretty high. I mean, that's the only way to really go about bringing in the funding up front to effectuate some solution. Every couple months as these bond ratings come in, it's costing us more and more to even have that discussion. So, which will, of course, lower our ability to do those projects.
Is there anything that David just said, Elizabeth, that you would disagree with?
Well, you know, there's debt and then there's pension. Moody's throws those two things in the same bucket. Your debt is very manageable. Your pension is the thing that is the heavyweight in the room. And now, you know, the 7.46% versus the 4%. Very few municipalities use that 4.34% Citibank index. So it might make sense to get more conservative on it eventually, but that's just a calculation. I mean, the real key is coming up with a plan to try to control the cost side as well as the payments that you're making to fund it. So I think coming up with a plan in that direction would be very helpful. When you talk about additional debt down the road, you know, I think there's two types of debt. There's the general obligation debt that's really guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the tax base and the unlimited tax levy. And then there's revenue bond debt that might be subject, paid from specific revenues. For example, water sewer bonds. That's a specific revenue bond debt that is not going to be a burden in their calculation like more general obligation guaranteed debt. So we can look at those different options for you, but your debt on its own is not the problem. It's the pension, and Moody's has a nice graph that I'll share with you on that too. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that, you know, talking to Jeff and Anne Marie, is like, well, what do the other rating agencies think about this? Should we look at a different rating agency for another opinion? Never hurts, right? See what's out there. Standard & Poor's has something out there called a rating estimator. It's online. So, you know, without getting into absolute numbers, we went through, and on page 6 you can see their estimator on the economy. You know, if you look at the red line on the right, the far right side is positive, the far left side is negative. So 1 is very positive, a 5 is very negative. So we're positive on the economy. Management is great. Management in place. Budgetary flexibility, given your fund balance, is very strong, and budgetary performance is good. Liquidity is very good. Debt and contingent liability, again reflecting the pension, is low. But I'll tell you, that part of the rating does not have real numbers in it. It's a little loosey-goosey, so we'd have to go get into more depth with regard to that rating, but just based on the estimator. And then the institutional framework, that means as a municipality in the state of Illinois, which is basically an A underlying rating, how are you? It comes up with a AA-. That's equal to your AA3 that you just had, that you just got knocked down from Moody's. So that may be something we want to look at going forward. just so you know, if we even do that with another bond issue, we can, and that's helpful to have two rating agencies' opinions out there, but it doesn't mean investors aren't still going to be aware of and know that Moody's rating. So just a little food for thought, something we might think about as you move forward with any debt plans in the future.
So looking at this report, a number of these items are controllables. We could certainly control some of this, other than the debt and contingent liability, where we get our lowest score, and that ties into the pensions.
Correct.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
And this tale of woe is being reflected in other communities, not just DeKalb, Illinois, as we all know.
Yes.
Kate?
Yeah, I was going to ask the question, how common is DeKalb's situation?
Very.
Okay.
You aren't the worst.
Oh, yippee.
What was that answer? What was that answer? What was that answer, Elizabeth?
You aren't near the worst.
We are not the worst.
You are not the worst.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm like, yes. Dave and I agree. Yippee.
Yeah.
Yes, Tony?
Just so, hindsight's 20/20. Moody's is being very conservative, which they should be, because prior to 2008, all three of these reporting agencies were listing mortgage-backed securities as AAA. So, we need to take some of the advice with a grain of salt. We have to live with their ratings. That's a system we have to live in, but also, obviously, they've been burned severely by their past judgment. So we just need to watch out for that.
I'm going to play sort of the middleman, and that is between David at the far end and Tony, you at your end, and that is that I think we do have some controllables. And we as a city council have to continue to take a look at our revenues versus our expenses. We have to make sure that our finance advisory committee, along with our finance department, takes a strong look at this, working with folks like you, Elizabeth. Do you have any final comments?
Nope, that's it. Just
Any other final comments here? Good. If not, we're just a little bit later. We're going to start our regular city council meeting. If we adjourn this meeting, we'll start that at 10 minutes past 6 o'clock. Dean?
Mayor, were you going to call separately for public participation?
Thank you. Is there any public participation? Is there anyone who would like to address any of the items either on this agenda for the committee of the whole or on an item not on the agenda? If not, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn the committee of the whole.
So moved.
Been moved?
Second.
Been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned. We'll reconvene at 6:10.